In just 11 hours, two of the most powerful men in America came dangerously close to shaking the country to its core. Elon Musk went public with an accusation against Donald Trump that triggered outrage, speculation, and a wave of instability that rippled through Wall Street and Washington alike. It wasn't just noise. It was the kind of feud that makes headlines scream and advisors panic. And caught right in the center of it, without warning or protection, was Vice President J.D. Vance. He didn't give a speech. He didn't post a statement. Instead, he picked up the phone. Once to Musk, once to Trump. What followed wasn't loud, wasn't televised, and wasn't supposed to change anything. But it did. The feud cooled. The tweets vanished, markets steadied. And for a moment, the storm paused. Not because someone shouted louder, but because someone dared to speak quietly. This story wasn't captured on record. The words you'll hear, the choices made, they're imagined. But the weight behind them? That part is real. Because in a time when power often shouts, we believe in exploring what might happen when someone chooses to speak with quiet conviction. This may not be how it happened, but for many of us, it feels like how it could have, and maybe how it should have. Stay with us. This is a story that earns every second of your time. He thought silence was safety, until silence became the only weapon left. J.D. Vance sat up straight in bed before he was even fully awake, heart pounding in that strange pre-dawn panic where dreams blur with dread. His phone buzzed twice, short, sharp, insistent. In the stillness of his Washington, D.C. hotel room, the sound felt louder than it should have, like something urgent had slipped through the seams of the night. He blinked against the glow of the screen. 2 messages, 2 names. Trump, you need to handle Musk. Now. And just seconds before that, a social media alert. Elon Musk has tagged at Trump in a tweet. Funny how some names show up in the Epstein files again and again. Not saying anything, just watching. JD didn't move for a full minute. Not a breath, not a blink. Just stared, caught in that quiet, electric moment where the air feels too thin, like the room knows something it's not saying. Outside his window, the Capitol loomed in shadow, its dome lit faintly like a lighthouse trying to guide a country through fog. Washington never really slept, but it had its quiet hours, moments like this, when the drama paused just long enough for consequences to gather. He exhaled, finally, rubbing his face. It wasn't just a tweet, not from that man, not at that man. This wasn't noise. It was a trigger, and Vance could feel it being pulled. He thought of Trump's people, already awake, spinning, strategizing, weaponizing their anger. He thought of Musk's millions of followers, amplifying every character like it was prophecy. He thought of the markets, of China watching, of the donors texting, of the headlines already being written by journalists or still in their pajamas. And above all, he thought of the silence from everyone who mattered, because no one wanted to be the one to step between 2 giants. But JD was already there, whether he liked it or not. He swung his legs out of bed, still shirtless, toes touching the cold floor like a baptism, back into the chaos. His mind moved faster than his body. What was Musk's motive? Why now? Was it personal or political? A jab? A bluff? A declaration of war? He checked the tweet again. Just enough ambiguity to deny. Just enough poison to infect. JD could see exactly how the press would tear into it, how late-night shows would frame it, how foreign actors would clip and remix it into disinformation. Trump wasn't the kind of man who forgot things like this. And Musk? He wasn't the kind who apologized, which meant this wouldn't fizzle. It would spiral, and it might already be too late to stop it. JD's hand hovered over his phone. Call the chief of staff? Wake the comms team? Text Elon? Text Donald? He didn't know yet. What he did know, what he felt in his gut, was that this night wouldn't be forgotten. Not by him, not by anyone. There was a rhythm to political crises, a heartbeat you could feel if you were close enough. JD had spent months listening, staying quiet, reading the room. Tonight, the room was starting to shake. He walked to the window. DC below looked calm, but he could feel the current beneath it, like a storm humming just under the ground, looking for its first lightning strike. And then came the third buzz. He didn't recognize the number. The number on the screen didn't matter. JD knew before he picked up, this wasn't just a conversation, it was a beginning. A trigger had been pulled, and now the whole machine was awake. By the time he stepped into the hallway, staffers were already moving at that specific speed only Washington understood. Fast but measured. Urgent but pretending not to be. Phones pressed to ears. Laptops open on benches. Half-formed sentences flying through the air like shrapnel. Something had erupted, and everyone was trying to stay ahead of the blast radius. He didn't speak as he walked. Didn't need to. The looks told him everything. The ones who nodded slightly, the ones who looked away. Each face was a temperature reading. The heat was rising. By the time he entered the war room, the walls already felt tighter. Screens were flickering, news clips looping, headlines updating by the minute. On one monitor, Musk's tweet had been blown up in full resolution. On another, early headlines, Musk hints at Trump-Epstein link. Vice President silent as feud erupts. No one said a word as JD stepped in, but every eye followed him. It wasn't deference, it wasn't fear, it was expectation, the kind that lands like weight on your chest. He stood there for just a second longer than necessary, enough to let the silence press in. Then, as expected, his phone rang again. Trump. He didn't hesitate. Picked up. Turned slightly away from the others, not to hide but to shield the weight of what was about to come. The voice was unmistakable. He crossed a line, JD? A pause. I don't care how rich he is. I don't care how many rockets he builds or followers he's got. You don't play games with that name. Not that name. JD didn't interrupt. He didn't agree. He didn't deny. He just listened, because that's what this moment required. Behind him, aides pretended not to hear, but everyone was hearing everything. There were no private conversations anymore, only controlled leaks. Trump continued, his voice hard and fast, not yelling but pressing, like a man punching through a wall with words. I want this shut down, fast. You talk to him, you get his people in line, and if he won't apologize, he better feel what happens when he picks a fight he can't win. JD's fingers tightened slightly around the phone, but his voice remained level, deliberate, almost too calm. I understand. That's all he gave. That and silence. He didn't promise action. He didn't commit to retaliation. He simply let the words sit, because anything louder would turn the conversation into a contract. And JD had learned painfully that in rooms like this, what you don't say matters just as much as what you do. Trump hung up without a goodbye. JD stared at the screen for a moment longer, then turned back to the room. Still, no one spoke. No one needed to. In the distance, a CNN banner updated again. Musk tweet sparks White House response. JD's name wasn't mentioned, not yet, but he could feel it closing in, like the tide moving under a docked boat, silent, inevitable. He took a breath, not deep, but steady. This wasn't going to be fixed in public. This wasn't about press statements or speeches. This was a pressure that had to be handled without a microphone, without applause, without noise. And that's what made it so dangerous. Because in Washington, the louder you speak, the more people assume you're in control. But tonight, J.D. Vance was silent, and yet everyone was listening. The ride back to his apartment was silent. No aides, no flashing motorcade. Just a black sedan humming through D.C. at 4 a.m. The city lit like a theater after everyone's gone home. J.D. Vance didn't speak. He barely moved. He just stared out the window, watching the monuments glide by. Icons carved in stone, now barely visible through the fog glass. He let himself in quietly, as if the silence of the place had something sacred to protect. The apartment wasn't grand, nothing like the homes of the men he now found himself between, but it was still, and right now stillness was all he needed. He dropped his coat over the back of a chair, loosened his collar, and sat. No TV, no music, just the hum of the fridge and the buzz still echoing in his chest. The tension from the last call hadn't left. It was in his spine, behind his eyes like a low-grade voltage that wouldn't shut off. He'd been here before, not in D.C., not between two billionaires, but in this same emotional terrain. Same script, different setting. He closed his eyes and memory opened like a window. the living room in Middletown. Yellowed wallpaper. A mother's voice, sharp and cracking, fighting with another man whose name didn't matter because they all sounded the same. Raised fists never landed, but the fear did. Every time. JD was 10, maybe 11, standing between them, not yelling, not crying, just holding the air still. He had learned young. If you couldn't stop the fight, you could at least slow it down. You could be the buffer, the silence in between, and that somehow became a kind of power. Now here he was again. The men had changed. Their weapons were digital, their platforms global, their egos uncontained. But the fear in the air, the sense that something fragile was about to split, that was the same, exactly the same. This isn't just a fight, he thought. This is a referendum on what kind of country we want to be seen as. He wasn't being asked to choose between two individuals. He was being asked to choose between two visions, two interpretations of strength, loyalty, truth. One man wielded noise like a sword, the other influence like oxygen, everywhere, unavoidable. And both somehow had the power to define what America looked like to the world in the next 48 hours. JD leaned forward, elbows on knees. He felt the weight not as pressure, but as clarity. Trump wanted obedience. Musk wanted immunity. But what America needed was something else. Someone else. Someone willing to do what no one else had the stomach for. Not take a side. Not because he was weak. Not because he was undecided. But because the country didn't need more lines drawn in the sand. It needed someone to see beyond them. He stood slowly, walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water. His reflection in the window caught his eye. Tired, unslept, but steady. He didn't recognize this version of himself fully, but he trusted it. Trusted the man who could hold a storm in silence. This wasn't going to end with an apology. There would be no press conference, no handshake. What came next would be quieter. And if done right, no one would even know he'd been there at all. He turned off the kitchen light and headed to his desk. A blank notepad waited beside his phone. It was time to write down what no one wanted to say aloud. Because sometimes the man in the middle isn't the one with the least power. Sometimes he's the only one who still sees the whole board. By mid-morning, the question had already become a narrative. Where was J.D. Vance? It was the kind of vacuum Washington couldn't stand, not because it mattered, but because it might. And when something might matter, the press has a way of sharpening it into certainty. The headlines came in waves and they all pointed in the same direction. Vice President silent as Trump-Musk feud escalates. Where's JD? The man who wasn't there. The accessory VP. Is Vance just Trump's echo? It would have been easier to respond. A quick press statement, maybe a tweet with just enough edge to seem active. That's what staff suggested. That's what the optics demanded. But JD didn't care about optics this time. Not because he underestimated the media, he didn't, but because he understood the stakes more than they did. This wasn't about perception. This was about leverage. And leverage, when used too loudly, collapses. So he left the press room empty. A chair with his nameplate sat untouched during the daily briefing. Reporters glared at it like it had something to hide. He sat instead in a small, unmarked office 2 floors above, away from the West Wing press traffic. No cameras, no leaks. Just a single staffer screening calls and a pot of coffee that had already gone cold. From there, he started dialing. Not to journalists, not to Twitter. He called CEOs, not spokespeople. He asked for private updates from military liaisons he trusted, people who didn't need to embellish facts for party lines. He reached out to senior donors whose interests spanned both tech and defense. The rare few who understood that this wasn't just about a tweet. It was about a split in the power structure that financed half of Washington. He didn't leave messages. If they didn't answer, he called again. Not urgently, but steadily. Like someone building a net they might all have to fall into soon. When one former intelligence chief picked up, the man sounded groggy. I take it you saw the tweet? JD didn't answer directly. I'm not calling about the tweet. I'm calling about what happens after. The man was quiet a moment, then responded. That's the right question. For the next few hours, JD pieced together a private map. Unofficial briefings, whispered concerns, speculative damage forecasts. How foreign adversaries might exploit the feud. how investors were bracing for volatility, how trust, already fragile, was beginning to splinter at the highest levels. He didn't speak much, just listened, took notes, asked short, deliberate questions. He knew they were watching him, not just the press, but the people who mattered in moments like this. The ones who understood that the real power in Washington isn't about volume, but timing. And JD was waiting for the right moment to act. Not to defend himself, not to defend Trump, and certainly not to protect Musk. He was waiting to defend the one thing no one else in the building seemed to care about that morning. Stability. By noon, the press had grown louder. Cable news cycled the same images. Musk on stage, Trump at a rally, an empty chair with JD's nameplate. Pundits laughed, speculated, mocked. But upstairs, the silence deepened. Not as retreat, but as preparation. JD Vance wasn't absent. He was assembling something stronger than sound bites, the truth beneath the noise. And when the moment came to speak, he wouldn't be clearing his throat. He'd already know exactly who was listening. By late afternoon, the noise had settled into a kind of rhythm. Background chaos, predictable in its volume, but not in its direction. The White House had released a generic statement about continued cooperation with key partners, and Trump's team had gone uncharacteristically quiet. Radio silence that made insiders even more uneasy. JD was still upstairs, still off-grid from the press, when his staffer entered without knocking. Just a nod. "He's available. 5 minutes. Encrypted line." JD stood without a word, walked into the secure line room, closed the door behind him. He didn't prepare notes. There wasn't time, and with Elon Musk, preparation often got in the way of reality. The line clicked. The connection was clean. No greetings, just Elon's voice, already mid-thought. "I know what this is," Musk said sharply. "Another insider freakout because I said what everyone else is too scared to say." JD didn't respond. Let the air settle. "I mean, look," Elon continued, his tone somewhere between conviction and paranoia. "We've all seen the names, the lists. The media pretends it doesn't exist, but people deserve the truth. I'm not attacking him. I'm saving democracy." JD paused. The instinct was to counter, clarify, control. But he resisted. Instead, he let a beat pass, just long enough to disrupt Elon's momentum. Then quietly, "And what happens if democracy doesn't survive your version of saving it?" The silence on the other end wasn't long, but it was loud. JD leaned in slightly, voice low and controlled. "You're not wrong about the problems, but you don't fix trust by burning the few structures still holding it together. You don't build truth by breaking everything in the process." Elon's tone shifted, more defensive now. "I'm not breaking anything. I'm challenging the old systems. They've failed. You think keeping quiet makes it better?" JD kept his voice steady. "No, I think being careful with fire matters when the house is already half in flames." Another pause. "This isn't about power, Elon. Not for me. Maybe not even for you. But it's about perception. And perception is how democracies breathe. Right now, you're making it harder for the country to breathe." There was a long stretch of static. JD could hear something in the background. Keyboard clacks, maybe a nervous assistant pacing the room. Elon hadn't hung up. That was something. "I don't know if you get it, JD," he finally said, tone flatter. "You grew up in institutions. I built mine. I don't owe them anything," JD replied without force. "You owe the people who believed in you not to destroy everything just because no one told you no." It landed harder than he expected. Elon didn't speak again. Not to argue, not to agree. Just a low breath and the soft click of a line cut. The call had ended. No apology, no commitment, but also no further explosion, at least not yet. JD stayed still for a moment, the silence in the room strangely heavier than the noise that had filled the day. He hadn't changed Elon's mind. That would take more than one call. But he had done what needed to be done. He'd planted a seed, not in Elon's politics, but in his ego. The seed of doubt that maybe, just maybe, tearing everything down didn't mean you'd be the one left standing on top. And sometimes that's all a conversation needs to be. JD didn't move for a while after the call ended. He remained seated in the secure room, elbows on the table, the stillness around him feeling less like peace and more like pressure holding its breath. The conversation hadn't resolved anything, but it had revealed everything. Elon wasn't just acting out. He was acting through fear, through anger, through the illusion that disruption, on its own, was a strategy. And Trump would respond to force with force. He always had, which meant that unless someone shifted the ground beneath them both, this wouldn't just be a headline, it would become a fault line. So JD went back to his desk, not the public one, not the ceremonial oak table in the West Wing office where photos were taken. The real one, the one with no windows, just paper, pen, and the quiet whir of old Vance. He didn't dictate to a staffer. He didn't open a template. He wrote by hand, carefully, deliberately. Memo. Internal use only contingency outlook. Strategic risks from executive-level feud escalation. The title alone would make most aides skim. That was the point. This wasn't a message for the loud ones. It was for the serious ones, the real adults in the room. If there were any left, he outlined everything. 3 pages. No flourish, no politics, just the facts. Page 1. Market projections. If the feud expanded, if Trump responded, if Elon retaliated, if leaks or subpoenas followed, the financial impact would ripple immediately. Institutional investors would panic. Defense contracts tied to SpaceX could stall. Tech markets would dip 6 to 9% in a week, with ripple effects on pension funds and retirement accounts across the Rust Belt. Voters don't care about tech stocks until their 401ks vanish. Page 2. National security. Hostile foreign actors would already be monitoring the fracture. China, especially, would exploit the instability, both in markets and messaging. Russia would fuel disinformation on both sides, stoking division not just in Washington, but in homes across the Midwest. It wouldn't take bots. It would just take screenshots. Page 3. Optics. The global perception of the U.S. presidency was already fragile. If Musk, arguably the most influential private citizen in the world, continued publicly undermining the former and possibly future commander-in-chief, allies would hedge. Enemies would wait. No one bets on a government fighting itself in public. At the bottom of the last page, JD signed with a single initial. V, nothing more. He didn't print it. He scanned it. Sent it to 2 addresses, one secure inbox tied to Trump's national security inner circle, the other routed to legal counsel at Tesla via a third-party encryption server. No name, no metadata. He didn't need credit. He didn't even want it, but he needed them both to see it. Not from him, but from the reality they were both too proud or too reckless to face. By the time he leaned back, it was almost dusk. The light in the office had gone gold, then gray. The city outside was still talking, still spinning its noise. But inside this room, something real had been said. Not out loud, not on a podium, but in writing. JD closed his notebook, took a slow breath. He hadn't ended the conflict. Not yet. But now both giants had been warned. Quietly, seriously, and in a language that didn't need cameras to carry weight. And if they chose not to listen, then history would show. They were told. By the time JD's plane touched down in Florida, the sun was beginning to fade behind the manicured palms of Palm Beach. The invitation, or rather the summons, had come just hours after the memo had been sent. No reply, no acknowledgement. Just a brief message relayed through an aide. The president would like to see you. Today. Mar-a-Lago looked the way it always did. Expensive, gilded, suspended in a kind of curated nostalgia. But something in the air felt sharper, as if even the wind was walking on edge. JD was escorted through the corridors in silence. No small talk, no staff briefing, just the long walk through a place that knew how to project power. When he entered the private lounge, Trump was already waiting, seated, drink in hand, eyes locked forward like he hadn't moved in hours. He didn't stand. Sit, Trump said. JD obeyed. There was a long pause, so long it nearly felt like a tactic. Then Trump leaned forward, voice low but burning. He called me Epstein's buddy on a public feed. JD didn't respond immediately. He knew better. When Trump spoke that way, he wasn't looking for facts. He was looking for loyalty. He didn't name you, JD said carefully. Trump's eyes narrowed. But he wanted people to think it. That's worse. The implication sticks harder than the accusation. You know that, JD. You know damn well how that works. JD folded his hands, stayed calm, measured. Yes, I know. Another silence. Trump stood abruptly, began to pace. I built this movement. I carried half the country on my back. And now this little emperor of Mars gets to come in, throw around conspiracy trash, and I'm supposed to what? Let it go? JD let him talk. Let the heat rise. This wasn't a tantrum. It was strategy through volume. But it was also something more dangerous. Wounded pride. Trump stopped and turned. I want blood. JD met his gaze. Even, steady. You don't need to win this fight, he said. You already won the country. The room didn't go quiet. It just shifted, as if the atmosphere had changed weight. Trump blinked, caught off guard by the framing. You think that matters if people start whispering my name with Epstein's? You think victory protects against that? JD didn't flinch. I think trying to win a petty war with someone who thrives on chaos is a trap, and I think you're too smart to fall for it. Trump didn't answer. He sat again, slower this time. The glass in his hand remained untouched. People are watching JD, he said. They need to see strength. They already did, JD replied. They saw you take a hit and not flinch. That says more than any counterpunch ever could. There was a long pause, not hostile, just unfinished. Trump exhaled through his nose. Not quite agreement, not quite surrender. Do you believe he'll stop? JD shook his head once. No, but you can. For a moment, the storm held its breath. Then Trump stood again, more composed this time. The meeting was over. No handshake, no parting words, just a silent understanding that something had been diffused, but not defeated. As JD exited the room, he felt the humidity wrap around him like the tension hadn't left, just followed him outside. He had said what needed to be said, not to win, not to persuade, but to remind a man who'd once held the country in his hands that real strength isn't in reaction, it's in restraint. By the time JD landed back in D.C., the whispers had already become a current, not loud, not public, but strong enough to be felt, strong enough to pull. The meeting at Mar-a-Lago had stayed quiet. There were no official statements, no photographs, no leaks, at least not from Trump's end. But silence in Washington rarely goes unpunished. Within 12 hours, the vacuum began to fill. First came the posts on fringe platforms, anonymous threads suggesting JD had caved, that he was covering for a traitor. Then came the podcasts. Right-wing voices, previously friendly, now raising eyebrows. Why isn't Vance defending Trump publicly? Why hasn't he gone after Musk? What's he hiding? Then came the labels. The hashtags. Hashtag Vance went soft. Hashtag accessory. Vice President. Hashtag swamp sleeper. The irony wasn't lost on JD. Many of the most aggressive smear accounts had been previously amplified by Musk himself or by groups funded through proxy by his allies. The billionaire's influence didn't just come in dollars. It came in algorithms, in reach, in retweets. The same machinery Musk used to build his empire was now quietly nudging JD toward political exile. And the MAGA loyalists? They didn't push back. Some joined in. Others looked away. Few remembered that just 2 days earlier, JD had been the firewall between chaos and combustion. But that's how DC worked. You could save the ship, and they'd still throw you overboard if the storm didn't look heroic enough. JD didn't respond. He didn't deny. He didn't explain. He kept his head down, eyes forward. Because once you start defending yourself, you've already accepted the terms of someone else's narrative. Still, the threats came. Some clumsy, some chilling. Messages slid into his direct inboxes, masked phone calls from out-of-state numbers, emails with photos of his family's names in the subject line. The kind of poison that was never fully serious, but never fully dismissible either. Security was tightened. His team advised he take a day off. He didn't. Instead, he walked the halls of the Capitol quietly, took fewer meetings, said less than usual. If they thought his silence meant weakness, that was fine. Let them think it. Silence was becoming his strategy, not because he was afraid to speak, but because they were afraid of what he might say if he ever did. And truthfully, it hurt, but not in the way they thought. Not the personal attacks, not the betrayals. What pierced deepest was the realization that the very movement he had once believed in, fought for, and helped rebuild, was now devouring itself. He had stood between two giants to stop a collapse, and somehow he had become the most convenient enemy of both sides. But there was one thing they didn't understand, one thing they couldn't smear into submission. J.D. Vance didn't enter politics to be cheered. He entered it to be useful. And usefulness, unlike popularity, didn't require applause. It just required resolve. So he let them talk, let them mock, let them spread the narrative that he'd gone soft. Because sometimes the hardest men to break are the ones who don't swing back. The headlines hadn't stopped. Neither had the messages. But by Thursday morning, J.D. wasn't in D.C. anymore. He was in Middletown, Ohio, where the voices were fewer, the streets were slower, and the ground beneath his feet felt like it had weight again. No press knew he was there. No staff accompanied him. He drove himself early, long before the town stirred. The gravel crunched beneath his tires as he pulled into the small cemetery just east of the river. It wasn't grand, just grass, quiet, and names carved into silence. He found her stone without effort. He didn't need to search. He never did. Bonnie Vance, 1936 to 2007. Tell the truth, even when it doesn't clap. He stood there for a while, hands in pockets, eyes scanning the engraving like it might blink back at him. The wind moved around him gently, as if it knew why he was there. The voices online had accused him of weakness, cowardice, silence in the face of insult. And part of him, a small human part, wanted to scream back, to post something sharp, to call out the hypocrisy, to demand respect for the restraint he had practiced like a discipline. But that part didn't win, because standing here, on this hill, he remembered what always came before the impulse, her voice. It was the night his mother disappeared for 3 days, and J.D., only 15, had punched a hole in the drywall, trying to keep himself from falling apart. Bonnie hadn't yelled. She hadn't even asked why. She just walked over, placed her hand on his shoulder and said, "Real men don't yell. They listen until it hurts." At the time, he hated it. Thought it meant weakness, submission. He wanted fire, wanted action. But now, all these years later, with a nation whispering his name in ways it didn't understand, he finally heard what she'd meant. Listening wasn't passive. It was deliberate. It was power held in stillness. And the hurt, that was part of it. Because choosing not to fight back when you could meant you had measured your anger and chosen something greater than revenge. Standing at her grave now, he realized he wasn't just being pulled back to her voice. He was being forged by it. He took out a small piece of folded paper from his coat. Not a speech, just a thought. Words he had written the night before, alone in his apartment, staring at a country that didn't know what it wanted from him. He read them aloud, softly, just for her. "I'm not going to shout into the void just to prove I'm alive. I'm not here to entertain chaos. I'm here to hold the line while everyone else tries to set it on fire." The wind picked up slightly, brushing past him like approval. He didn't stay long. J.D. never did. He never asked for answers at this grave. He came to remember that the answers were already inside him. As he turned to walk back to his car, the noise of the world seemed farther away. The comments, the threats, the smears, they hadn't stopped, but they had shrunk. Not because they mattered less, but because he did. He didn't need to win the internet. He needed to keep the country from losing itself. And that meant acting, not reacting. He would choose the next move carefully, quietly, and when it came, they wouldn't see it coming. But his grandmother would have. She always knew silence wasn't the absence of power. It was the moment before it changes everything. The first tremor didn't come from Washington, it came from Wall Street. Monday morning opened with a red wave that had nothing to do with politics. Tesla stock dropped 7% before the bell even rang. By noon, it had plunged 14%. Not because of quarterly earnings, not because of regulation, because of a tweet and the war it sparked. Elon Musk had said nothing more since his original post, but that silence was its own form of signal. The markets had read it clearly. The richest man in the world had just accused the former president of something radioactive, and he hadn't taken it back. He hadn't even blinked. By Tuesday, it wasn't just Tesla. Defense contracts linked to SpaceX froze. Quietly, cautiously. Mid-level officials at the Pentagon flagged reputational concerns. Procurement requests sat unsigned. One multi-billion-dollar satellite launch partnership was delayed for internal review. Investors noticed. Defense analysts noticed. China definitely noticed. Cable news lit up with charts and speculation. Panels of experts talked over each other. Everyone blamed everyone else. And no one asked what it meant that America's two loudest egos had turned the economy into a battleground. JD had seen it coming. He'd warned them. The memo he sent last week was now being circulated among senior staff as if it had dropped from heaven, though no one mentioned its anonymous origin. It didn't matter. The predictions were unfolding almost hour by hour, and yet the real storm hadn't hit. That came behind closed doors, when JD sat across from the Secretary of the Treasury in a secure conference room, no press, no staffers, just 2 cups of bitter coffee and a single question on the table. How bad could this get? He didn't dramatize. He didn't need to. Supply chain sentiment's already dipping, JD said quietly. Contracts are freezing. Overseas partners are asking if SpaceX is still stable. If that hesitation spreads to NATO satellites or missile defense systems, we've got more than a market slide. We've got an allied confidence crisis. The secretary listened, tapping a pen, his face tight. JD continued, and that's just the external. Internally, we've got the MAGA base calling Musk a traitor, and Musk's fan base treating Trump like a dinosaur with a Twitter problem. These aren't just audiences. These are voters, workers, donors. If this fractures any deeper, we're looking at a split coalition heading into an election year. Another pause, then JD added more softly, I'm not saying we stop the feud. I'm saying we stop letting it lead the headlines. The secretary leaned back, exhaled slowly. You think either of them will listen? JD didn't answer directly. He just looked down at his hands for a moment. I think they might, he said, if they realize they're not just torching each other, they're burning the floor they both stand on. Outside the room, reporters shouted questions no one answered. Traders stared at monitors no one trusted. Musk's legal team issued a one-line statement. No further comment at this time. Trump's camp released a veiled jab. The country doesn't need distractions. It needs leadership. And the markets kept trembling. But JD, he stayed quiet, because what he had to say next wouldn't come in a press conference. It would come in the form of a decision no one expected, quiet, strategic, and calibrated to keep a country from falling into a war, not of weapons, but of wounded pride. The collapse had begun, but if he moved carefully, the freefall might still be slowed. The next morning, JD was escorted through the sub-level of the Eisenhower building. No press, no aides, just a secure clearance badge and a knot in his chest that tightened with every step underground. He had been summoned to a closed briefing by the NSA. No context, no agenda, just a single subject line. Perception, stability risk, priority channel. Inside the room, 3 analysts waited. 2 men in dark suits, 1 woman in military uniform. No introductions, no chit-chat. Just the kind of atmosphere where even silence had clearance. A screen lit up behind them. No maps, no troop movements, just screenshots. Dozens of them. Chinese language media clips with headlines translated below. Infighting in American leadership, evidence of collapse. Elon Musk exposes corruption of Western elite. Russian state channels weren't subtle either. Trump betrayed by his own government. Musk, last honest man in the West. The woman spoke first. Calm, crisp. We haven't seen coordinated amplification like this since 2016, but this time it's cleaner, more subtle. They're not trying to stir chaos. They're Curating a narrative. JD leaned forward. Which narrative? The man beside her answered. That America is broken from within. That our billionaires don't trust our leaders. That our leaders are too weak to respond. That our system, at its core, is eating itself. JD said nothing, but his jaw tensed. Another analyst clicked to the next slide. More screenshots, viral memes, bots posing as U.S. veterans, posting anti-Trump and anti-Musk content, both designed to be picked up by opposite echo chambers. Side-by-side feeds showing how the same event was being spun in completely contradictory ways for different audiences. This isn't cyber warfare, the analyst continued. This is narrative manipulation. And we're not losing because we're vulnerable. We're losing because we're helping them. JD stared at the screen. They don't need to hack us anymore. The analyst nodded. We're doing it for them. He exhaled slowly. It was the kind of realization that doesn't land with drama, but with dread. The press thought this was about reputations. Wall Street thought it was about stock prices. But what was unfolding now wasn't a financial crisis or a PR mess. It was a psychological destabilization, a slow, intentional fraying of how the world saw America, and worse, how Americans saw themselves. And it was working, because while two men argued in public and millions cheered from digital sidelines, foreign powers were sitting back, quietly capturing the global conversation. JD stood. Who else has seen this? The room paused. A brief exchange of glances. Then one analyst replied, We sent a version to Homeland. Intel committees got redacted excerpts. White House hasn't responded. JD didn't ask why. He already knew. The White House was busy doing what Washington always did in moments like this, waiting for someone else to take the blame. As he left the room, his phone buzzed. Another headline, another attack piece, another reason to speak. But he didn't, because now the stakes had changed. This wasn't about Musk or Trump anymore. It was about the mirror they had unknowingly handed to the world, one that made America look cracked, divided, and weak. And JD Vance, he had to decide whether he would be part of the next explosion or the quiet hands rebuilding what was breaking. That night, JD stayed late in his office. He didn't speak to anyone. He canceled all briefings, ignored his phone, and told his staff not to knock unless the building was on fire. The NSA report hadn't shaken him. It had confirmed what he already feared, but it hadn't broken him. What broke him came in a plain white envelope. No return address. No staff flag. It had been forwarded through 3 different offices before landing quietly on his desk, nearly lost beneath a stack of printed economic forecasts and a half-drunk cup of coffee. It was written in pencil, on lined notebook paper. Dear Mr. Vance, my name is Andrew. I'm 12. I live in Kansas. My dad lost his job this week because of the stock stuff. He works with trucks. I don't understand all of it, but Mom says it's because the market crashed after that man tweeted about the other man. I know you're a grown-up who helps people. Can you stop them, please? My little brother cries a lot now, thank you. Andrew TJD stared at the letter for several minutes without moving. He read it again, slower, just to be sure he hadn't imagined the rawness in the words. The pencil marks were faint in some places, darker in others, pressed harder, maybe when the boy felt something deeper. My little brother cries a lot now, a sentence too simple to be written by anyone, but someone living it. It didn't read like political theater. It didn't read like spin. It read like truth, and it crushed him. He leaned back in his chair and let the letter fall gently to the desk. His fingers trembled, not from rage, not from fear, just from the weight of knowing that somewhere out there, in a house with more questions than answers, a child had looked to him not for inspiration, not for leadership, but for help. It had never been about the markets, not really, or the reputations, or the legacy of 2 men fighting for dominance of a national stage. It was about Andrew, and every Andrew in every forgotten town that never made it onto a campaign trail. This wasn't symbolic anymore. This was real. Real children, real parents, real jobs, real nights filled with questions no child should have to ask. And JD, in all his calculation and restraint, realized that maybe he'd forgotten what that silence was meant to protect. Not pride, Not optics. People. He stood and walked to the window, the letters still clutched in one hand. DC glittered below, distant, indifferent, moving too fast to feel anything. It made statements. It passed resolutions. It held press conferences. But Andrew didn't need a press conference. He needed adults to stop playing gods with the gears of a system that people like his father relied on just to survive. JD's throat tightened. He hadn't cried in years, not at funerals, not at victories. But standing alone in a room full of flags, holding the handwriting of a 12-year-old who should have been writing about baseball or science fairs, not layoffs and market crashes, he finally did. He wiped his eyes without shame, sat back down, pulled out a blank sheet of paper. He didn't know yet what he was going to write, but for the first time since the feud began, JD knew why he needed to act. And that made all the difference. JD Vance had hoped for more. He stood at the head of an old oak table in a creaking farmhouse 2 hours outside Washington, deep in the Virginia countryside, where the cell service was weak and the air smelled like memory. The location had been chosen precisely for that reason. Off the grid, unremarkable, safe. A place where history might quietly reroute its course. But instead of Trump and Musk, he got their proxies. Trump sent Dominic Reed, his notoriously volatile senior advisor, the man reporters privately nicknamed the flamethrower in a flag pin. Musk, in contrast, dispatched Dr. Lena Morales, a sharp, inscrutable AI ethicist with no prior public political footprint. She arrived in a quiet black car and spent the first 10 minutes refusing coffee. JD noted the contrast. One came to dominate, one came to observe. Neither came to listen. The wooden table groaned as the aides took their seats, separated by 2 empty chairs meant for the men who had set the country on fire from opposite ends of the internet. JD remained standing. He didn't raise his voice, didn't pound the table. Instead, he slid a thin folder across the center. Identical copies marked confidential, strategic deterioration risk. Inside were charts, risk indexes, media pattern analyses, foreign intelligence briefings, and a printout of a child's letter in pencil. Andrew's letter. "I didn't invite you here to argue," JD began, eyes steady, "or to defend anyone's pride. I invited you here to understand the cost, not in theory." In households, Dominic scoffed and leaned back, folding his arms. "Cost? You want to talk cost? Trump built this country back from the edge. Musk thinks he's Jesus with a battery pack. And you think they'll stop because you passed around some emotional blackmail?" Lena opened her folder silently. She studied the contents as if decoding a puzzle. JD didn't react. He simply continued. "Every empire falls when its leaders start arguing in front of the peasants. That's not a threat. It's a timeline." Silence followed, not the defensive kind, the calculating kind. Reed's knee bounced under the table. Lena tapped a finger to her lips, reading one of the graphs on digital sentiment manipulation. JD walked toward the window. The fields outside were quiet, still green even in the early autumn chill. Generations had harvested here, argued here, forgiven each other here. No headlines, no followers. He turned back. "Here's what I propose. A ceasefire, not in words but in implication. A week of silence, no tweets, no interviews, no statements. Let the country breathe." Dominic barked a laugh. "You want them to disappear for a week? In this media cycle?" JD replied evenly. "Not disappear, just give the American people a moment to look away from the chaos and remember themselves." Lena finally spoke. Her voice was soft but firm. "Even if I wanted to persuade Elon, he'd reject silence as surrender." JD nodded. "Then tell him to redefine silence, not as losing, but as leading without noise." They left without confirming anything. No handshakes, no declarations, just folded folders and unreadable glances. As the sound of the cars faded down the gravel road, JD sat at the now empty table. He stared at the 2 vacant chairs, one for Trump, one for Musk. They hadn't shown up, but their absence spoke louder than any speech. And somewhere in Kansas, a boy named Andrew was waiting for someone, anyone, to stop yelling long enough to fix what had been broken. JD whispered aloud to no one. I'm still here. The screen stayed dark. JD stood by the fence just beyond the farmhouse, holding his phone to his ear, listening to the sterile sound of a call that refused to connect. First Trump's line, then Elon's. Voicemails both times. He didn't bother to leave a message. He knew neither man listened to recordings. The September wind brushed against his jacket, tugging at the edges like a restless child. Fields stretched out around him, quiet and endless, dotted with browning grass and fading rows of late corn. The kind of place where news didn't break. It withered. Behind him, the farmhouse creaked as aides packed their folders and muttered parting words. The gravel had long settled from their cars. He was alone now, truly. JD stared out into the stillness, fingers tightening slightly around the phone. So this is what diplomacy looks like, he murmured. Emptiness. He slipped the phone into his coat pocket and crossed the short path toward the fence. Leaning against it, he let the silence press in. This wasn't the silence he knew from his childhood, the kind that followed shouting and broken dishes. No, this was different. It was wider, older, a silence that didn't wait to be broken. It just was. He picked up a stone from the dry soil at his feet and tossed it gently into the field. It disappeared without sound, just like his memo might, just like this meeting might. His mind wandered back to something Lena Morales had said, offhandedly, as she walked out. The world doesn't need noise to fall apart. It needs disinterest. JD had come here hoping that proximity, just getting people close enough, might break the fever. But neither man had bothered to show. What kind of leaders sent foot soldiers to extinguish a fire they started with their own hands? The ache in his chest wasn't anger. It was something heavier, something that didn't shake off easily. He thought of Andrew again, that boy from Kansas who wrote letters instead of tweets, who still believed leaders read more than they shouted. What would he say if he saw all this effort end in closed doors and unanswered calls? From somewhere far away, a hawk cried out, the only sound in the sky. JD took a breath and pulled his coat tighter. He knew the next days would be worse. Wall Street had already started to wobble. The media would dissect this failed summit before nightfall. The questions would multiply. The critics would circle. And still, no answers from the men at the center of it all. Maybe they thought waiting was power. Maybe they thought silence meant someone else would blink first. But JD understood something they didn't. Sometimes silence wasn't a strategy. Sometimes it was surrender dressed in arrogance. He looked down at his phone one more time. No missed calls, no texts, just a blank screen and the echo of a world holding its breath. The drive back from the farmhouse was quiet. Too quiet for the storm JD knew was coming. The aide in the front seat offered him updates in a low voice. Stock analysts bracing for another dip. Online speculation that the summit had failed. Murmurs that JD had lost control. But JD didn't respond. He just looked out the window, watching the fields roll past like a film he couldn't pause. He tried to bridge the divide, tried to make them see what was coming, but they hadn't shown up. They hadn't called. And even now, hours later, the silence on both lines remained total. But something had changed in JD. The silence no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a doorway. Back in D.C., inside the stillness of his office, JD sat down, loosened his tie, and opened a new legal pad. One page, one headline, one strategy. The middle is a weapon too. He underlined it twice, slowly, then leaned back, breathing in the weight of the idea. For weeks he'd played the go-between, waiting, hoping one man would call the other, that decency or strategy or self-preservation would kick in. But what if they never would? What if the only way out wasn't pushing them together, but pulling them apart carefully? He began sketching boxes on the page, like a chessboard. One side labeled Trump, the other Musk. In the center, Vance. Then he wrote a single line above them all, one truth at a time, one ego at a time. He would call them, not together but separately, no drama, no three-way conference. This wouldn't be a performance, it would be surgery. He'd start with Trump, because Trump understood loyalty. He expected it, demanded it, and JD knew exactly how to speak his language. Stakes, power, legacy. Remind him that he'd already won the country and that public brawling would only cheapen the brand he built. Then Musk, a different animal entirely. Logic draped in chaos. But somewhere beneath the performance art was a man obsessed with systems. JD wouldn't appeal to pride. He'd appeal to consequence, data, global leverage, how every tweet ricocheted into national security. He would lay the truth before them like mirrors and let them see themselves in the wreckage. He glanced at the clock. Midnight. No better time to start. He picked up the phone, dialed Trump's private line. No answer. He left no voicemail, just sent a text. Need 8 minutes. Just you and history, nothing else. He set the phone down and stared at it, knowing Trump would respond eventually, if only out of curiosity. Next, Musk. He opened a secure app, typed one line, "Just sent a memo to Treasury. You'll want to talk before they do." It wasn't a bluff. The memo he'd written, outlining the economic vulnerabilities created by this feud, had been delivered to senior officials, anonymously, carefully. But the pressure now had a pulse. JD stood and walked to the window. The Capitol shimmered beneath a tired moon. The city didn't sleep, not really. But tonight it felt drowsy, like a giant unsure of its own footing. He took a breath, deep and slow. He wasn't sure if this new plan would work. Wasn't sure if truth, delivered slowly and without spectacle, could still break through to men drunk on their own mythologies. But he knew one thing. Waiting had failed. And maybe, just maybe, dividing the fire before it burned, the house was the only path left. The buzz came at 2:07 a.m. JD was still at his desk, shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, a cold cup of coffee abandoned beside his notes. The city outside had finally gone to sleep, but JD hadn't. He didn't trust silence anymore. Not in this storm. The screen lit up. Musk, private line JD, let it ring twice, then answered. Elon. There was no greeting, just breath and accusation. You leaked the memo, didn't you? Elon's voice was sharp, clipped, the kind that lived 1 inch from impulsive. JD didn't respond immediately. He let the tension breathe. Does it matter who leaked it, JD said calmly, or what it said? It matters if it paints me as the reason America's crumbling. You're not the reason, JD said, but you're giving others a blueprint on how to finish the job. Elon scoffed. I'm trying to fix the damn job. You tweeted about Epstein, JD said, and tagged a former president. You called him out in front of 200 million people, then watched your stock nosedive and blamed the wind. You think I care about Tesla stock? Elon snapped. No, JD said. I think you care about how history remembers your name. That slowed him. JD could hear it, the silence between defensive breaths, the slight pause of a man not used to being called by his deepest ambition. You want to be remembered as the man who colonized Mars, JD continued, not the one who tried to burn Earth on his way out. Another pause. Then Elon's voice, quieter now. I didn't think it would go this far. JD leaned forward, elbows on his desk. That's the thing about fire. You don't always mean for it to burn the village. Elon sighed. I wasn't trying to burn it. I was trying to light it up, make people wake up. We're being run by cowards and frauds. Maybe, JD replied, but revolutions don't start on social media. They start with responsibility. A longer silence. For the first time in weeks, JD heard something in Elon's voice that wasn't bravado. It was weariness, the kind that seeps in when even genius runs out of rope. So what now? Elon finally asked. You want me to apologize? No, JD said, standing now, pacing the floor. I want you to be smarter than this. That doesn't mean backing down. It means choosing which war is worth it. You think Trump's worth protecting? I think the country is, JD said flatly. And if I don't, stop. JD stopped walking, looked out the window into the dark again. Then you've already decided what kind of page your name lands on. No answer. JD let it hang. This wasn't about coercion. It was about conscience. And whether Elon Musk had any left that hadn't been twisted into performance. Thanks for taking the call, JD said gently. It meant more than you think. Before Elon could respond, JD added one last thing. You don't need to tweet about this. You don't even need to answer me. Just do the math. play it forward, and decide if that's the future you want your sons to grow up in." Then he hung up. He stared at the phone for a moment. No ringing, no buzzing, no chaos, just stillness. And then JD walked back to his desk, picked up the second phone, the one marked T-line. It was time to make the next call. The second call came just before dawn. The sky was still dark over Washington, but a faint purple bleed had begun to appear behind the clouds. JD stood in the kitchen of his apartment, staring at the steam curling from a fresh mug of coffee, his third in 4 hours. He tapped the secure line. "Call, DJT, secure." The phone rang. Once, twice. Then a voice answered, gravelly and unmistakable. "Vance, this better be good." JD smiled faintly. Trump never said hello. "It's about Musk," JD said steady. "It's time we stop reacting and start choosing who we want to be." On the other end, silence, then a snort. "Is this some kind of sermon? I thought you were calling to tell me he's backing down." JD took a breath. "I'm calling to tell you that trying to silence him only makes you look threatened. You don't need to silence him." Pause. "You need to outclass him." The line went quiet. JD pictured Trump sitting in a leather chair, likely at Mar-a-Lago, TV on mute, phone in one hand, ego in the other. The former president didn't deal in compliments, he dealt in dominance. But even he understood strategy when it was framed as glory. "Outclass," Trump repeated, as if tasting the word. "You make it sound easy." "It's not," JD said, "but it's cleaner, smarter, more lasting. If you try to crush him, he plays the martyr. But if you elevate the conversation above him, he looks like a child throwing sand." Trump grumbled. "He called me Epstein's golf buddy. You want me to pretend that didn't happen?" "I want you to make sure history remembers that you didn't flinch," JD answered. "Because when leaders look petty, the country looks weak. And right now, we don't have the luxury of looking weak." There was a long pause. Then, with a gruff edge softening slightly, Trump muttered, "Maybe you're right." JD said nothing. Sometimes the most powerful thing was to let a man claim a thought as his own. But Trump wasn't done. "You ever say that on camera," he added, tone sharpening again, "and I'll pretend I don't know you." JD cracked a smile. "Understood, sir." Click. The line went dead. JD stood there, phone in hand, letting the quiet settle. Not triumphant, not relieved, but grounded. He hadn't changed the world, but he'd nudged it. And sometimes nudging giants was the only way to stop them from stomping the village. As light began to bloom across the city, JD returned to his desk. 2 calls down, 2 men still standing. Now came the hard part, getting them to walk away without needing someone else to fall. It started with a blink, no announcement, no apology, just silence, and a vanished tweet. At 7:12 a.m. Eastern, Elon Musk's post, the one that had accused Donald Trump of being Epstein's golf buddy, disappeared from X. No explanation, no reply, no replacement, gone. Within minutes, screenshots flooded the web. Threads lit up. Analysts speculated. Cable news anchors broke their usual monotony with breathless updates. Had Musk caved? Was it legal pressure? A hack? A truce? But J.D. Vance knew better. He stood alone in a small side office inside the Eisenhower Executive Office building, watching 3 monitors blink in unison. No aide stood beside him. No advisor whispered strategy. He didn't need either. The deletion was the answer. At 7:37 a.m., just 25 minutes later, Donald Trump posted on Truth Social, "Some people build rockets. Others build legacies. Know the difference." It was cryptic, controlled. No all caps, no slurs, no nicknames. Just composed. Presidential almost. JD didn't flinch, but his shoulders eased ever so slightly. He didn't expect a handshake, or a press conference, or any sort of shared credit. That wasn't how this worked. Not with men who saw the world as a battlefield, not a boardroom. He reached down, muted the news coverage, and leaned back. Outside his window, the Capitol dome caught the morning light. Across the city, D.C. buzzed with energy and confusion. Journalists scrambled for theories. Editors demanded new headlines. The story had shifted, but no one quite knew how. The real move, JD knew, was not in what had happened. It was in what didn't. There was no follow-up tweet from Elon, no late-night rant from Trump, no executive orders, no lawsuits, no retaliatory leaks. Just a pause. In a city addicted to escalation, that silence felt deafening. Somewhere across the river, aides on both sides were likely spinning the story into their own narratives. Trump would say Musk backed down, Musk's camp would say they simply moved on, and pundits would keep guessing which one of them blinked first. JD didn't care, because in that gap between deletion and discretion, he saw something rare: restraint. He stood up, walked to the window, and watched the sun slide above the rooftops. This was never about winning. Not really. Not for him. It was about recentering the country before it tilted too far. About proving that leadership didn't have to scream. That sometimes the most powerful line in the script was the one you chose not to say. Behind him, his phone buzzed once. A simple text from a senior staffer. "We might have just dodged a war of egos. Thanks." JD didn't reply. He didn't need to. Instead, he picked up a pen and scribbled 3 words onto a legal pad by the window. "Let silence stand." Then he tucked the page beneath a folder marked "Private" and walked toward the door. He wasn't finished yet. There were still aftershocks coming, still narratives to guide, still people, ordinary people, watching, wondering who to trust. But for now, for the first time in days, the storm had stopped. And J.D. Vance, the man caught between 2 giants, had done the one thing nobody expected. He'd made them both go quiet. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that made every breath feel intentional. J.D. sat across from the host of the American Resolve podcast, a well-regarded voice in political media, known for sharp questions and sharper timing. The backdrop was minimal. No flags, no framed awards, just a table, 2 microphones, and the weight of the moment. The host leaned forward. "So, Mr. Vice President," he said with a small smirk, "did you win?" JD took a slow breath, glanced down at the table for a beat, then met the man's eyes. "That's the wrong question," he said calmly. "The country didn't lose. That's enough." A pause, a silence that wasn't awkward, but earned. The host raised an eyebrow as if measuring the gravity of the answer. "Some would say you walked a tightrope. Others think you stayed silent too long." JD smiled faintly. "I wasn't silent. I was listening. That's different." He adjusted his sleeves, his voice steady. "I knew there'd be people waiting for a spectacle, a televised moment, a viral mic drop. But real leadership doesn't always happen in front of cameras. Sometimes it's what happens when the cameras turn away." The host tapped his pen lightly. "What do you want to be remembered for?" JD looked off, not at anything in particular, just toward the space where memory lives. Not for picking sides, for holding the center. When the loudest voices pulled at us, I chose not to be an echo. Outside the studio, the sun was setting across D.C., soft light painting the buildings gold, as if even the city itself wanted to pause before the world spun forward again. The episode aired within the hour, and while most clips from Washington sparked outrage or applause, this one did something stranger. It made people think. The desks weren't full, but the room felt alive. A high school in Dayton, Ohio. Not elite, not underfunded, just ordinary, just American. Posters of the Constitution and civic diagrams lined the walls. A small U.S. flag hung slightly faded above the whiteboard. The teacher, Mr. Cartwright, leaned against his desk as a clip from JD's interview played from the classroom projector. His students watched silently, the image of JD's calm reply filling the screen. When the video ended, a junior in the back raised her hand. "Why didn't he just pick a side?" she asked. Her tone wasn't critical, just curious. "Wouldn't that have been easier?" Mr. Cartwright smiled, not patronizing, just proud. "Because real leaders," he said, "pick us." There was a pause, a moment where the usual tension of adolescence, grades, rumors, future plans, took a back seat to something heavier, more real. Another student chimed in. "But didn't that make everyone mad at him?" "Yes," Mr. Cartwright said, "but he understood something rare. Sometimes when everyone's shouting, the bravest thing you can do is not shout back. It's listening that takes guts. The students nodded, slowly. Not all at once, but enough to matter. And somewhere, maybe without realizing it, a few of them learned that politics wasn't just about parties or polls. It was about presence, about refusing to let the nation become someone's game board. Mr. Cartwright turned off the projector. "All right," he said. "Next up, midterm prep." But as the lights came on, the energy in the room didn't fade. It shifted, from noise to thought. J.D. Vance's Senate office wasn't flashy. It had the usual leather chairs, the D.C. skyline peeking through tall windows, and the faint scent of fresh folders and old debates. But on one wall behind his desk hung a single frame. No medals, no photo ops, no honorary degrees, just a screenshot. The tweet. The one Elon Musk had posted during the peak of the feud, accusatory, blistering, the one that nearly fractured the political and economic spine of the country. The one he had deleted. Under the screenshot, etched into a simple brass plaque, were 10 quiet words. They almost burned it down. He kept the match. No one asked JD about it. Visitors noticed it, of course. Some stopped and stared. A few aides suggested adding context or moving it elsewhere. JD refused, because it wasn't a trophy, it was a reminder of how close the edge had felt, of how power unchecked could become a fire without flame, silent but consuming. In the weeks that followed, commentators kept debating what really ended the Musk-Trump feud. Some credited political maneuvering. Others said the economy forced their hands. A few called it luck. But those close to the moment knew the truth. J.D. Vance didn't win a war. He prevented one. By not choosing ego. By not feeding fire with fire. By choosing, quietly, steadily, America. That plaque remained untouched for the rest of his term. And long after the tweets had been buried by newer headlines, and the men behind them had moved on to their next ambitions. The story that stayed was of the man who didn't chase legacy. He protected it. In a world where volume is often mistaken for value, this story reminds us of a rare kind of courage, the kind that doesn't demand the spotlight. J.D. Vance stood between two of the most powerful forces in modern America, not with fire or fury, but with quiet resolve. While others shouted, he listened. While the nation waited for a winner, he chose something harder: balance. This wasn't a tale about outshining Musk or outmaneuvering Trump. It was about protecting something much bigger: public trust, national stability, and the fragile thread of unity that too often frays when egos clash. What makes JD's journey so powerful is not that he solved every problem, but that he dared to respond with maturity in a moment built for outrage. That kind of restraint is no longer celebrated as it should be, but perhaps it's exactly what we need more of. This story may be fictional, but the tension it explores is real. How do we lead in a time of noise? How do we choose country over self, dialogue over dominance, truth over tribalism? JD didn't leave behind applause. He left behind a question mark, and sometimes that's more enduring than a victory speech. So let me ask you this. In a divided world chasing headlines and heat, would you have the strength to be the calm when everyone else is the storm? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.